What's up guys, this is the Lance Meta Part 2, if you can call it that. More on that later. Either way, we're talking about status builds. I'm Miles, welcome to the Goebbels Lantern. Before I throw a bunch of armor sets at you, I think it's worth taking just a little bit of time to understand how status works, because in doing so we'll be able to understand how best to build for status, and it'll help us notice some of the traps that you could fall into when building for status, which will help us avoid them. So first of all, why are you running status? And I'll split this into three main reasons. First of all, status is really good if you're struggling with a monster. Maybe you're struggling to hit the weak points, and so Blast and Poison might be good options. Or maybe the monster's really aggressive, and you'd like an extra pause in the fight to give yourself a bit of breathing room. And in that case, maybe Paralysis or Sleep is what you're after. Second reason, it's decent in multiplayer. Each status has a value in multiplayer for a different reason. Paralysis creates a free knockdown, which results in a lot of damage when everyone just wails on the monster. Blast is pretty great if you've been forced to hit non-weak points because the monster's turn to fight someone else. And in a similar vein, Poison will still let you get some damage off when the monster is charged off to the other side of the map while attacking the light bowgun user. And finally, and arguably most importantly, you just want to use status weapons. Maybe you get a kick out of paralyzing the monster, or you enjoy sleep bombing. Maybe you have no reason, you just want to use status. Brilliant. Never let anyone tell you that you shouldn't. And on that note, I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't use status. So first off, status builds are quite a big damage loss compared to Tigrex. Even with the added benefits of having the status, you're still going to end up having slower hunt times. And for Lance specifically, it's doubly so. Now that we have Spiral Thrust, our hits per second have decreased compared to older games, and so our ability to proc status is also much lower than it was in the past, but it seems like the status on our weapons hasn't been adjusted for that. We can alleviate this by removing Spiral Thrust for Anchor Rage, and you can still get competitive times with Anchor Rage, but they will be worse than if you were using Spiral Thrust. The other issue is that pets exist. We have not got the time to talk about the ins and outs of cats and dogs, but the long story short is that their damage is kind of naff, but their ability to dish out status is really good. But it does lead to the question, if you want status, why are you not using your cats? But there are a few answers to this. Maybe you want more status. We'll come on to that later. It's not the perfect answer to this question. But a better answer is that you want more control over when the status happens. And the final nail in the status coffin is that some of the decorations are really expensive. Poison's fine, it's only a level 1, but the fact that Blast, Paralysis, and Sleep are all level 2 decorations, which makes it really difficult to justify putting them in an armor set. With all of that said, status still has a place, and if you want to use it, go ahead and use it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But if you want some guidance on how best to use status, I've got some builds for you. Quick interim, I was going to put this after the builds, but I think it's better here. Status in the game is a little bit misleading. The actual amount of status you have is effectively a third of what's displayed, and that's because status only procs 1/3 of the time. Not to mention that the way the game determines when it procs and when it doesn't is also a little bit finicky. But apart from that, status should work as it has in the previous games. The only other exception is Poison, but I'll cover that when we're talking about Poison. Interim over, let's dig in. So let's start off with the Paralysis and the Sleep builds. I'm putting them together because as a status they function identically, and because they both use the same lance. You're going to find that this is a bit of a recurring theme in this video. Unsurprisingly then, as it's the only lance that can do Sleep and Paralysis, the best lance for for these statuses is going to be your Rampage Lance. The best way to build your Rampage Lance is choosing Sharpness Type 1 in the first slot, using your second slot for status, and then the final slot is affinity. This will leave you with 190 raw, 20% affinity, 15 status, and white sharpness, assuming that you use Handicraft 1. I'll quickly show you the other sleep and paralysis weapons. It should be pretty obvious why we're using the Rampage here, because all of the other weapons just have abysmal stats. The only other thing that you might see is that the Rampage Lance has quite low status. The reason why we have low status on our status lance is because, one, using a higher status lance, like the Volvidion lance for example, doesn't get you an extra paralysis per hunt. And that means that increasing the amount of status you have is only bringing, when that paralysis happens, closer to the start of the fight. And personally, I think that's actually a bad thing. I'd prefer my paralyses and sleeps to happen sort of middle to late of the fight, rather than right at the start. Moving on, let's talk about poison. I was unsure whether or not to lump poison in with paralysis and sleep, and that's partly because poison is a very different status to paralysis and sleep, but that's also because we build the armor set ever so slightly different. We are going to use the same lance though. So what's different about poison? Unlike paralysis, sleep, and blast, poison's status happens over a long period of time. Thankfully, Rise has changed how poison works, so you can continue to apply poison status towards your next activation of poison, even when the monster is currently poisoned. And that means that high poison can keep a monster poisoned for very long periods of the fight. And then the second main difference between poison and paralysis/sleep is that its decoration is only level 1, and so it's infinitely more accessible. But ultimately, we're still building the armor set in a very similar way. And that's because for the majority of monsters, poison is just a damage thing, and you're going to get more damage from raw than poison. The one exception is Kushala, and if you're really struggling with Kushala's Black Wind, then maybe swapping to a higher poison lance, like the Pookie one for example, might be worth it, but you should only really be considering the option to do that after you've put poison weapons on 2 dogs and you've brought both of them to Kushala. But if you're still struggling with his Black Wind at that point, maybe it's worth it. And finally, we've got Blast. It's a really weird status. It's very close to just damage, but the fact that it's fixed damage and hit zone irrelevant makes Blast useful for a few things. Notably, breaking parts and fighting monsters with terrible hit zones. The other thing that's great about Blast is that the Rampage weapon isn't better than everything else. Although maybe that's a bad thing if you like changing the look of your weapon. Regardless, the best Blast Lance is Teostra's. Firstly, it's got the highest blast out of all the lances, and secondly, it's got a higher EFR. And honestly, its EFR isn't bad. I was doing tests, and in a hyper-specific situation that is completely untrue to how you're actually going to fight monsters, Teostra's can technically win over Tigrex. If, for some reason, you're only able to do triple pokes against this hypothetical monster, and this monster is so weak to blast that every 6 hits you get a blast proc, then Teostra is slightly better than Tigrex. Unfortunately, if you put it in a real situation, it falls much further behind. But hey, there's a reason why we're talking about Tigrex here and not in the main meta video. Final note about Blast. Someone mentioned in the comments that they really wanted Basil's Lance to be a thing, but unfortunately it's not, at least in the terms of damage. But this is also a good point to mention that damage doesn't always mean everything. The Basilgeuse Lance still has a niche. It gets access to Brutal Strike, which more or less negates its negative affinity, which frees up loads of armor skill space for anything wacky that you want to put on, like Slugger or 5 points of guard. In a similar vein, there are loads of different ways that you could be building status for your own personal needs. These are simply the best sets, assuming that you don't need any extra skills like guard. The only other major alternative to these sets that I can think of would be to drop damage completely to focus on status, but at best you'll only get one extra status off when dealing with status weak monsters. But even at that point you have to ask yourself, is it worth dropping all of this damage just to get to that point? The final thing I need to mention is that depending on your charm, the way that you build the armor sets will be slightly different, which is why it's more important to focus on the skills and then plug them into an armor set builder. If you're doing that and you're struggling to match or improve on the armor sets I've shown, then dropping crit boost will be the best way of keeping your damage high. And that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a like. If you're interested in me talking about elemental lances, why not subscribe? And if you have anything else to say, leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching. Peace out.